All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. I'm really intrigued by our lesson tonight. Um, there was some of all of this stuff that I knew coming into it, but one of the things that I enjoy so much about preaching and teaching is to be able to preach and teach. I have to learn things myself, and so there's a lot of things that I've come to learn, and some of my views even change. In fact, I kind of want to begin by correcting two minor things that I said last week. Both of them just mentioned in passing. One of them being in talking about the flood and how the depths of the deep burst forth, not just water, but most likely the magma shooting up into the lava. I mentioned that the waters would have been boiling. That was an exaggeration. The waters would have been hot, which we believe would have created the atmospheric change that led to the Ice Age. But we do believe that there were animals that were still alive within the water. So if it was boiling, that couldn't have happened. So there was a heating of those waters since they were underwater volcanoes exploding, which was part of what shot the oceans over the continents. But the water was not necessarily boiling. That was an exaggeration on my part. Again, doesn't really change anything that I said about last week, but just something I wanted to correct. And then one other thing. This is something that I learned just this week. I mentioned that it had not yet rained up until the flood. That's something that I've heard my entire life. That when at the flood was the first time that it had ever rained. And actually, when I said that last week, when I was up here talking, and I said it, in my head, I thought, that doesn't seem right. Based off of everything else that I've been teaching, that may be something I need to go back and check and see if that was just a myth that has been around and is very prominent. And sure enough, the first thing I did when I got home last night, I looked it up, and I'm led to believe now that that was wrong, that it had rained prior to the flood. And so I'm going to explain to you why, because I think that is a prominent belief that the flood was the first time it had ever rained. There are two main passages that myth is pulled from. Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 through 6 says, "The Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground." And so the belief is that up until the flood, that the Lord used this mist to water his creation. But what we've got to understand here in this Genesis 2 is not necessarily after Adam and Eve were created. Genesis 1 is the general account of creation, and then Genesis 2 kind of rehashes Genesis 1, but goes into greater detail. Genesis 2 is a more specific telling of the creation story. And so as we look at this, and I mean, again, he specifically says there was not a man to till the ground. So he's talking about this mist being here before man was created. And so all that this says is that before day 6, or at least before God created man on day 6, that there had not been rain. The mist is what watered the earth during the creation week, before God finished the whole natural processes of how everything would work. The mist was there, and the mist was what watered creation. However, the presence of the mist prior to Adam and Eve being created does not preclude the existence of or the need for rain after Adam and Eve were created. So just because there was a mist before does not demand that there's also going to be a mist after. And so to demand that rain didn't happen until after the flood, based off of this passage, it has no more logical support than to claim from that passage that no one farmed until after the flood. Because again, in those two verses, God did not cause it to rain upon the earth, and it also says that there was not a man to till the ground. And so if we make the claim that because there was no rain before man was created, that there was no rain until the flood, then you could also make the same argument that because the ground had never been tilled before man was created, the ground was never tilled until the flood either. And so you don't have to make that jump that because there was no rain before man was created, that there was also no rain after man was created. And really, the thing that jumped out in my mind last week was thinking about the water cycle. And as I'm talking about the way that the earth works and the earth functions, and how for plants to grow and trees to grow and all these other things, it's got to be a young earth. It can't be millions and billions of years old, because flowers need bees to pollinate them. Plants need birds and bees and other animals to pollinate. God created a creation that needs each other. And so I got thinking about that. If I'm going to make that argument about flowers and plants needing to be pollinated, then they also need water. And if you think about the water cycle, you've got precipitation, which then evaporates, causing cloud formation, which then causes more precipitation, which then leads to evaporation, more cloud formation, and so forth. And so as we look at the water cycle is tied to the sun's energy. And the water cycle is tied to many other aspects of the Earth's climate. And so if the rest of the Earth is functioning as normal, if the sun is giving off the energy that it's supposed to give off, if the other aspects of the climate are working as normal, then we should be led to believe that the water cycle is working as normal as well. And so while we cannot dogmatically claim that the water cycle was not prevalent, we have no reason to believe that it was not prevalent and that the world was functioning differently than it does now. One other verse that is used to kind of propagate that myth that it had not rained, Hebrews 11:7 says, by faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not yet seen, moved with fear and prepared the ark. Remember that Hebrews 11 passage is speaking of faith. It says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And Noah is given as an example of having faith, believing God, though what was promised to him had not yet been seen. And so some claim that the things that Noah had not yet seen would be rain, that no one had seen rain before the flood, but that is not necessarily the case. If we read that passage assuming that it had never rained, then that may be our natural reading. But if we read that passage assuming the earth was functioning as God created it to function and the water cycle was in process, then we would not read it that way. Most likely what this is referring to is the worldwide impending catastrophe of God saying, you need to build this gigantic ark because I'm going to send a flood that's going to destroy the world. Nobody had seen a worldwide catastrophe at that point. And so the faith that Noah exemplified was not faith in believing that water was going to drop from the sky, but was rather faith in believing of an impending worldwide catastrophe. So our conclusion on that is that while we cannot necessarily prove that there was rain, we also cannot use Scripture to disprove rain. If anything, since Scripture does not say that the world was functioning differently, we would have to assume that creation was functioning normally, which would assume that the water cycle was functioning. So, if any of you had been taught that and believed like me up until 7 days ago that it had not rained until the flood, there seems to be reasonable evidence to argue that it had rained before the flood. So, all right, moving on to the main topic at hand tonight. Last week, we did not get to the Petrified Forest and the Grand Canyon. And we're going to hit on those tonight. We're going to talk about dinosaurs and to further discuss how the flood in Noah's time changed the world. And the dinosaurs will eventually play into that as well when we get to the end of the dinosaurs. And again, if you remember last week, and really, I should say, just a reminder, this is our third week doing this, but the difference in science, people come to science with different views. Science is not always about the evidence. Science is about the interpretation of the evidence at hand. Again, which I don't mean to continue to harp on this idea, but is why some scientists show that wearing masks makes no difference in regards to the spread of the coronavirus, whereas now there are scientists saying that we need to double and triple mask. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, when the double and triple masking article came out, I saw another study from a university arguing that double and triple masking can actually cause it to spread even more. And so science is not always about the evidence. Nearly all science is biased. You go into science with belief trying to prove your point. And sometimes even with things like dinosaur fossils. Both of you agree these are fossils of dinosaurs, and this is a real thing. These are the fossils of a T-Rex or whatever dinosaur. You agree on it, but because you're differing views of history, a lot of times the disagreement isn't over science, it's over history. And because those from the conventional paradigm reject that God created the world, and rather the world is billions of years old, their understanding of what those dinosaur bones mean is going to be different than the person who historically believed that God created the world and the world is only 6,000 years old. So science is not always about the evidence. It's about what I bring to the evidence and then also my interpretation of the evidence based off of what I already believe. All right? So the flood. Remember, the flood was not just drip, drop, drip, this cute, funny story until suddenly the world was covered in water. It was a catastrophic scene in which not only was water falling from the sky, but the depths of the deep burst forth from the ground. Most likely worldwide earthquakes, underwater volcanoes that we know broke apart the continents. You look at the continents, they're pieces to a puzzle that fit together. Most likely before the flood, you had one gigantic piece of land and the rest of the world was water. The flood hits, the volcanoes burst forth, earthquakes are happening, splitting continents apart, ramming them together, creating mountains, and all other kinds of stuff. It was a cataclysmic, catastrophic event to where we read in 2 Peter chapter 3 that it destroyed the world. It did not obliterate it to where God had to create a new world, but when Noah and his family walked out of the ark, that was not the world that they knew beforehand. It was a completely different place that was radically and massively changed. And so a lot of that change can then be used to explain some of the things within life, such as the Petrified Forest and the Grand Canyon. Just curious, who in here has been out to Arizona and seen the Petrified Forest and the Painted Desert? All right, Hillary and I did in 2017. So a small handful of you guys. If y'all ever get a chance to go, I was really intrigued by the Petrified Forest. Again, the Petrified Forest, it's in the Painted Desert. You go out there, there's cliffs in the Painted Desert, and it has these layers of different colors. And so as you look out across this desert, there's these layers of different colors that supposedly was produced by erosion over millions of years. And then where the Petrified Forest comes in, you have fossilized and crystallized logs that are scattered throughout that Painted Desert. Beautiful, beautiful. And then that's probably an hour, hour and a half before you get to the Grand Canyon there in Arizona. So again, the Petrified Forest viewed through the flood paradigm lens. The Petrified Forest is rainbow-colored petrified logs scattered across the Painted Desert Badlands. Again, it's colorful gray, red, pinkish orange, blue, purple, and green layered hills, flat sandstone-topped mesas, sculptured buttes. Here, the severely weathered rock layers of the Painted Desert belong to what geologists would refer to as the Chinle Formation. The sedimentary layers consist of relatively soft, colorful mudstones, fine-grained silt stones, and occasional thin, hard sandstone layers in gray, white, or brown. And according to the secular story on the national park signs, a lush landscape flourished here in the past with coniferous trees up to 9 feet in diameter, towering almost 200 feet in the sky. They claimed that numerous rivers flowed through this luscious lowland where galleries of trees, ferns, and horsetails provided food and shelter for many insects, reptiles, amphibians, and other creatures. Over time, they claim, winds knocked over trees. Some fell into the rivers and got washed downstream, their branches and roots getting knocked off along the way. Meanwhile, distant volcanoes further out west spewed tons of ash into the atmosphere. Carried to the area by winds, the ash settled into the river sediments. Again, this is what they claim. Before those logs could decompose, some of the logs were buried in those river sediments that were also covered in the volcanic ash. Secular geologists admit that the failed logs had to be quickly covered by sediments. In an anaerobic, which is an oxygen deficient environment that would have slowed decay. So again, I want to stop here. Even the conventional paradigm people who believe that the world is billions of years old and this happened by erosion still claim that for those to be fossilized, something had to cause them to be immediately buried. They all agree on that. That's not argued. And in an oxygen deficient environment. All right. Now, biblical geologists agree with the rapid burial of these logs. It's just not in river sediment, but in flood sediment, with the flood causing the rapid burial. And again, there's no explanation for how the rivers would have caused the rapid burial. There's no explanation for any of that. That's just what they believe because they reject the flood story and what happened there. That's the best they can come up with. Also, point to make, something Hillary and I found out is that biblical scientists are not allowed, at least 3 years ago, when we were there, biblical scientists are not allowed permits to study in our national parks. To do scientific study, you have to hold to the conventional paradigm. You can't hold to a biblical paradigm, to a flood paradigm. And so we even see our government rejecting that this flood paradigm is even a possibility. And it's always been that way. It's not something new. And so biblical scientists have a very difficult time to be able to come in and prove a lot of these things that they know and believe to be true. Some other interesting things about all these logs that are scattered throughout the painted deserts out there. The vast majority of the logs are all oriented in the same direction. Now, why would this be important? Because when you have the flood that has come crashing down and spewing forth and has broken all of these logs, if you think about how God dried the earth, he sent the winds blowing over the waters, which what happened to the waters? Caused them to rush out. They rushed. Some was evaporating, some was rushing back out to the oceans, carrying logs with them. That's why all the logs are in the same direction. Essentially, what happened is you had a log jam, literally. That's why all those logs are there as opposed to being pulled out to the ocean, because they got stuck on all the hills in the painted desert. So, however, all genealogists agree that the volcanic ash content in the enclosing sediments became significant in the next stage of the process. So there's disagreement in regards to what caused the rapid burial. Of course, we believe the rapid burial is from the flood. The others agree it was from millions of years of rivers, but all agree that the volcanic ash content became significant in the next stage. The groundwater in the sediments dissolved silica from the mixed-in volcanic ash and carried it in to replace the woody structure within the buried logs, a process that can be quite rapid. So the reason that they did not rot is because that silica from the volcanic ash came in and essentially took over the wood particles. Tiny quartz crystals from the solution solidified to fill in the hollows, cracks, and eventually even the interior of the wood cells, sometimes even replacing the cell walls. Okay, but here's the problem with a lot of this is that all of this for conventional paradigm scientists is guesswork since they reject the flood. There's an extraordinarily easy explanation if you believe the flood. Again, we believe that part of the flood was volcanoes spewing up from all over the earth, hence creating the volcanic ash. The water pushing them down into the ground, where there would be volcanic ash there into the ground, which then mixed with those trees. That's an easy explanation. But since they reject all of that, it's all guesswork, and they just have to do the best that they can do. And so, again, you know, if you guys think about a tree that falls in your yard, it doesn't fossilize; it rots. So something had to happen. And so, what I have on your outlines there to kind of summarize all of this. One, the floodwaters violently ripped up and broke the trees, swiftly transporting the debris. Stumps and logs were then buried rapidly in wet sediment layers made of sands and muds, as well as ash from nearby volcanic eruptions. I want y'all to think, I had this in my notes last week. Actually, I still have my notes on here. I'm going to go back and try to look because I don't want to say something wrong in regards to how long all of this was. I know it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And some of you may know this better, so y'all can correct me if you think I'm saying something wrong. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. And then the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. Noah and his family were not able to get off of the ark until over a year. It was a little over a year. So you're looking at, this is how soggy and wet the ground was, is that the water was gone after 150 days, but they had to wait an extra 200 days until the ground dried out enough for them to walk around on it. And so that's how wet and soggy the ground was during all of this. And so if you think about when the waters are actually still on the earth, how all that pressure pushing down. Y'all have dove down and swam to the bottom of a pool to pick something up and your ears pop when you go down. You understand the water pressure. Some of you may have scuba dived. I've never done that, but y'all understand the further down you get, the more pressure there is. So you think about enough waters to cover the mountains, how much pressure that's going to be down at the bottom, pushing down on that soggy ground up underneath. A lot can happen. Secondly, the water in the wet sediment layers was saturated with chemicals, particularly silica from the decomposing volcanic ash, and quickly permeated through the wood of the buried stumps and logs. As the flood ended, the water subsequently evaporated, leaving behind the silica filling and replacing the wood. As the flood waters rapidly retreated off the continents into today's ocean basins, massive erosion shaped the emerging land surface, eventually exposing the petrified logs at today's topographical surface. So remember, they were buried down in the ground. As the water's rushing out, it's pulling layers off with it until those logs are exposed. There are some hills that weren't pulled away with the water, and so as those logs were exposed, they're washing out, they get stuck on the hills. You have a petrified forest that's only about 4,000 years old, as opposed to millions and billions of years. All right, next, we got the Grand Canyon. Very similar story, but the Grand Canyon, of course, we know it as the greatest of all the canyons. We know how big the canyon is, both in its width and depth. But also, a known thing about the Grand Canyon is, just like with the Painted Desert, all of the sedimentary layers that are seen in there. Those same sedimentary layers, interestingly enough, are found throughout the United States. In particular, in Colorado, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, the exact same sedimentary layers are found in those areas as found in the Grand Canyon. Other things that's important to note about those sedimentary layers as we consider how they were created is that marine fossils, such as seashells, fish, and octopi, are found in all of those levels. And as I mentioned last week, oftentimes in these fossil layers, they view it as like the different ages of the earth, the Jurassic age, the Ice age, the Triassic age, and all the different ages. Yet you find those animals within each ones. And sometimes you've got the footprint of one animal on the one layer and the bones in another layer. And likewise with the layers, if this was representing different periods of time, there's no mixing between those layers. You've got one clear layer and another clear layer and another clear layer and another clear layer. If it's something that happened over time, it would be gradual change. We don't find that gradual change there in the Grand Canyon or really anywhere else that we have the fossil record. Likewise, there's no erosion, there's no channeling between those layers, which all of those things would be evidence of time. Things that are millions or billions of years old would have to show signs of age, signs of wear and tear, signs of erosion and channeling. And there's none of that in all of these sedimentary layers. And so digging deep into the layers, we're going to think back to the flood, what I just mentioned. 6 months, the waters prevailed over the earth, with another 7 months of the waters abating. So the waters are over the earth in that Grand Canyon time for a long time. Again, with things being extremely soggy. Earthquakes, volcanoes happening, ripping things apart, slamming them back together, throwing layers on top of each other throughout all of this. And as I mentioned last week, as you follow those layers, what you find is, as opposed to it being periods of time, at the bottom, you find the deepest of the marine animals. At the top, you find closer to the top of the marine animals. And then eventually you get to the land animals, and you get higher up on the land animals. It's different. It's different ecosystems that are tossed on top of each other that are then fossilized in place by the flood. But then mixed in with all of that, because there's a flood, you find all sorts of marine animals that are scattered throughout the marine layers and the land animal layers. There's 4,000 feet of strata in the Grand Canyon that represent the early and the middle part of the global flood. There's other strata locally within the Grand Canyon region that goes above the Grand Canyon that's called the Grand Staircase. About 10,000 feet, that's 2 miles of strata on top of the Grand Canyon. This represents the later stages of the flood and the retreat of the waters, things that were done as that waters were shifting and carrying land with them as they were leaving. So we look at this. How were the layers cut out? Most geologists, even from the conventional paradigm, have jettisoned the idea that the Colorado River formed the Grand Canyon and formed all of those layers. So that even people who believe in evolution, they still don't believe it was the flood, but there's less and less and less evidence for them believing it's the Colorado River. For one thing, it would have taken tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years for that river to do that. And even then, most biblical paradigm people don't believe the river could do it then. And also, if the Colorado River created a Grand Canyon, why hasn't the Alabama River? And why hasn't the greatest of all rivers, the Mississippi River? Why is it that only the Colorado River did it, but no other ones? So there's question if it's even possible to happen over tens of millions or hundreds of millions of years. But even if it was possible for that to happen, for the Grand Canyon to be that old, eventually the sides of the canyon would collapse and break down. It's not possible scientifically for the Grand Canyon to hold itself up for that long. And that's, again, even ones who believe in evolution, who believe in an old earth, who reject creation science, are beginning to say it can't be the Colorado River because erosion would have begun to happen to the Grand Canyon by now. The biggest argument against it being the Colorado River, though, is this. The Kaibab, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Kaibab. The Kaibab Plateau is along the northern rim of the Grand Canyon, okay? The Kaibab River, or the Kaibab Plateau, stands way above the Grand Canyon, and it runs adjacent the Grand Canyon runs adjacent to the south of the plateau. And so for the Colorado River to cut the canyon, the Colorado River would have had to cut part of the canyon over here, flow up the Kaibab Plateau and down it, and then continue to cut the Grand Canyon. As many of you might know, water does not flow uphill, right? It doesn't flow up a plateau. But for it to be the Colorado River, it would have had to flow up the plateau and down the other side back into the Grand Canyon. We know that's not possible. And finally, some conventional paradigm people are beginning to believe that as well. And so how then was the Grand Canyon formed? All right. This is what we believe, is that there was not slow erosion by the Colorado River, but there was catastrophic erosion by the drainage of lakes. There's evidence of a big lake that extends all the way to the Painted Desert. In the area of Hoppy Lake, which goes all the way up into Utah. Also the Canyon Lakes area. This is over 500 cubic miles of water that's in the Hopi Lake, or is believed to be in the Hopi Lake at that time. You've got the Hopi Lake, the Canyon Lakes area. The dam breaks. All right, so this is as the waters are abating, as the waters retreating. You get a log jam that naturally dams up. Instead of the waters running into the ocean, you have a massive lake that covers Arizona, that extends all the way into Utah. Eventually, the pressure of that dam breaks, and whoosh, it's gone. I read a story. Oh man, my brain's going blank. One of the most well-known historians. He wrote the biography on Harry Truman. Wrote 1776. Anybody else read those? Somebody's got to read history in here. It's going to hit me in a second who it is. Like at 7:30, it's going to hit me the author's name. Anyways, he's one of the most famous historians. And the first book he wrote was on the Johnsontown flood up in Johnsontown, Pennsylvania. Okay. And what happened there was a lake that was dammed up for the purpose of, there was a sportsman group that met there that went to fish. They didn't keep up with that dam. They didn't keep it to standards. They lied. They falsified records. Eventually, that dam burst. And that water, because it had been dammed up with so much pressure, ran down that hill and completely obliterated an entire town below it. Thousands of people died, completely washed Johnsontown, Pennsylvania, off the face of the earth, gone. And that was just a lake that was put there as a country club for men to go fish in. And a lot of the presidents of our country went, and they were a part of that. They went and fished there. And anyways, that dam broke, destroyed an entire town. You think about a worldwide flood, dam breaks, all of that water washing out. Remembering how soft all of that ground is, because it's been under miles of water for over a year. All of that water running out instantly, carrying with it all of that soft mud, whoosh, wash right out to sea. Those floodwaters that were bottled up in the Hoppy Lake, in the Canyon Lakes area, when those waters finally broke, the pressure was strong enough to break through that Kaibab Plateau and break it apart. It then sliced through the barely hardened flood sediments of the Colorado Plateau. And so when we jettison the idea that time, millions and billions of years are necessary to create these things, and are open to the idea that change can happen quickly based off of catastrophic events, then we can understand Grand Canyon and Petrified Forest a little better. And for those of you who were here last week, I'm not going to go back over it, but Mount St. Helens, when it blew in 1980, completely transformed that area instantly. And so Mount St. Helens, everyone agrees, catastrophic event that completely changed that area. Think about a worldwide catastrophic event and what it could do. And so here's something that was said. I watched a little video today on YouTube about this, and here's what the man said. And also, he was wearing an Auburn hat, just throwing that out there. So he said, it's not a little water and a little time. Excuse me. He said, it's not a little water and a lot of time. It's a lot of water and a little time that created it. Again, the view is that it's a little water over a lot of time, but rather it's the opposite. It's a lot of water and a little time that created the Grand Canyon. All right. I would ask for questions on that, but I'll be honest, I'm probably not going to be able to answer them. So I presented to you what I know, and beyond that, you probably have to ask Hillary. She's smarter than I am. All right, so dinosaurs. What do we do with dinosaurs? Okay. Dinosaurs, I believe, are real animals. But much of what is known about dinosaurs is speculative. Some things can be learned about dinosaurs, such as were they carnivores or were they herbivores? You can learn those things based off their teeth and their claws that are found in their fossils. But there's still a lot of debate about a number of things about the dinosaurs, such as are they warm-blooded or are they cold-blooded? And if you hear somebody saying it is fact, it's not fact, that's just their guess. There are a lot of things about them that we don't know. A lot of things such as the color of their skin, we don't know. We don't know about the texture of their skin, though I will admit there have been a very small amount of skin impressions that have been found around some of the dinosaur fossils. So there may be a few of them that we can have logical guesses or educated guesses on what their skin texture is. But for the vast majority, we don't know, and it's all guesses. Much of what is believed about how they looked, about their nature, their character, how they behaved, much of what is believed about them are guesses based off of sizes and shapes of bones. And many, I'm not saying they're wrong, many of them are educated guesses, and much of them is right. But I'm just making the point that just because we acknowledge that they're real animals doesn't mean that everything you hear about them is correct. A lot of it is guesses. In fact, dinosaur scientists have been known to be wrong. For instance, when I was a kid growing up, one of the dinosaurs that we were taught about the most was the Brontosaurus, all right? You had the T-Rex that killed everybody. You had the Triceratops that had the 3 horns on the front. You had the Stegosaurus that had the scales, the pointy scales all the way down the spine. And then you had the Brontosaurus, you had the pterodactyl. That was like the 5 main dinosaurs that were taught. Now they say there's no such thing as a Brontosaurus. Why? Because they realize that they accidentally mixed and matched different fossils. They put a wrong head on top of the skeleton of the Apatosaurus. And so it was a head that belonged to another dinosaur, a body that belonged to the Apatosaurus, and they called it a Brontosaurus. And then they taught us that in school, just like they taught Pluto was a planet, and they changed that, right? And so there's some things that they are wrong about. But there's a lot that again, even if can't be proved, that there are a lot of good educated guesses on dinosaurs. So when did dinosaurs live? Well, they've got to be less than 6,000 years old because God, or around 6,000 years old, because God created everything in 6 days. He created land animals on day 6, which would have meant that he created them and humans on the same day. Also, dinosaurs could not have been before human beings, considering that death and bloodshed did not come about until Adam and Eve sinned. I guess you could make an argument that the T-Rex was a nice, friendly herbivore, and so I guess that's a possibility. I guess that would have to be the case because, again, They would have been created on day 6 with Adam and Eve. However long after that Adam and Eve sinned, then the curse affected all of creation. And part of the curse is, I guess you got the T-Rex that you know now that became the hunter. So they would have been created at the same time as Adam and Eve. They would have lived on the planet at the same time as humans. Means they were created a little over 6,000 years ago. Interesting things. Are dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? Are dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? You're not going to find the word dinosaur mentioned in the Bible. And here's the reason. Because the word dinosaur was not created until 1841. Discovered by a British scientist, Richard Owen. The first dinosaur fossils were discovered by a British scientist named Richard Owen, who was a staunch anti-evolutionist. So he believed in the creation paradigm. He had been studying the bones of an iguanodon and a megalosaurus and realized that these represented a unique group of reptiles that had not been classified. So he created the scientific classification and he coined the term dinosaur from different Greek words, which means terrible lizard. So, dinosaur, terrible lizard. The word was created in 1841. Therefore, the Bible was written a long time before 1841, which means the word dinosaur is not going to be in there. But that does not necessarily mean that the animals are not in there. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Job chapter 40. I'm going to have to run through this quickly because I want to get to this. So, Job chapter 40, beginning in verse 15. All right? This is where God's confronting Job, where Job was claiming that God had done wrong and he shouldn't have done what he did. And God's reminding him, who are you to question me? And verse 15, behold, behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near a sword, for the mountains yield food for him, where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him. The willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can one take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with a snare? All right, I'm going to, chapter 41 describes Leviathan. I'll get to Leviathan in a second. But we do believe that Behemoth and Leviathan are real historical creatures. God is explaining creation to Job. Real, literal things in creation. He's doing it sarcastically, saying, Job, explain to me how these were created. If you're so much smarter than me, explain how this works. If you're so much more mighty than me, then why don't you try to go out and trap Leviathan? And all that. So he's describing real things from creation. It doesn't make sense for him to suddenly get figurative and then go back to describing real things. So we believe these are real creatures. The question is, who are they? Many believe that Behemoth is an elephant or a hippo. But as we look at this whole description, we believe it's an elephant or a hippo because they're in water. They're water and land creatures, and they're massive. But there's no animal that fully fits this description today. The key verse to this is verse 17. It says, he makes his tail stiff like a cedar. At least that's what my version says. I'll get back to that more in a second. His tail is stiff like a cedar. Regardless of what it says, different translations say different things, but all of them say his tail is like a cedar, which means that this animal would have been massive. And most argue for the elephant or the hippo because they do not believe dinosaurs would have been alive then, because remember, millions and billions of years old, dinosaurs before humans and all of that. So they don't believe dinosaurs and humans existed at the same time. Can't be a dinosaur. The best other thing they can come up with is elephant or hippo. All right, then there's other people that say, well, this is figurative. Again, there's no reason to believe it's figurative. Others just kind of ignore this verse because it is very difficult Hebrew that is used here. This Hebrew does not translate very easily, which is why nearly every English translation says something different. And so they say maybe this is a misunderstanding of Hebrew. It's a misinterpretation. So we're just going to ignore verse 17. See, some say that he raises his tail. Some says he stretches his tail. Some translation says he ties up his tail. Others, he moves his tail. Some, he bends his tail. His tail is rigid. He sways his tail. Nobody can figure out the Hebrew there. It doesn't translate into other languages. But what does translate is his tail is like a cedar. What he does with that cedar-like tail is what we can't figure out. But what does translate is it's like a cedar. If you hold to the belief that dinosaurs would have had to have been alive in Bible times, could that have been a dinosaur? Possibly. We don't know for certain, but possibly. Leviathan, all right, chapter 41. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down his tongue with a cord, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, the hope of a man is false. He is laid low even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me? And then, for sake of time, he goes on to talk about how it's essentially impossible to catch him. Oh, one thing, let's jump down to 19 because this brings the dragons into it. All right, it's going to blow your mind when I start talking about dragons. All right, verse 19. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils come forth smoke as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes from his mouth. In his neck abides strength, and terror dances before him. We then jump down to verse 32. Behind him, he leaves a shining wake. One would think the deep would be white-haired. On earth there is not his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. Whew. What an animal. All right. Some things about the Leviathan. Verse 7 and 8 says, even if we will draw it up with harpoons, he says a massive battle will take place. And if anyone does try to battle with it, God says it will be not only his first battle with Leviathan, but also his last, because Leviathan cannot be contained, which he then, side point, makes the note to Job. If no one is so fierce that he dares to stand up to Leviathan, who then are you, Job, to think you can stand up to me who created Leviathan? That's the point God's making, but then he just continues to drive it on further. Now, many believe that this is a crocodile or alligator. That's the best explanation. But if those of you who have Prime Video at home, if you go home and get on Prime Video, you can search for a show called Gator Boys. My kids became obsessed with this for a while. It's this crew down in Florida. You know, they have tons of gators down in Florida. If you get a gator in your pool or your pond, you can call Gator Boys. And this joker, barefooted, with no weapons or anything, goes and wrestles this alligator. Seriously, he stands in front of it, and he touches him on his top of his mouth and then under his mouth, top of his mouth and under his mouth. And then he circles around him, and he wears the gator down until he jumps on his back and puts him in a headlock. And another guy comes in with duct tape and duct tapes his mouth. He even does it in the water. He'll swim under there and get a gator in a headlock under the water. And so we look at this. There's nobody that dares wrestle Leviathan, and if you do, it will be your last. There's some idiot down in Florida wrestling gators now that they made a TV show about. Right? So it's most likely not a crocodile or a gator. All right. This brings in the dragons. What about 18 through 21 about breathing fire? We again said at the beginning of this that this most likely is not figurative. He was describing real creation. Could he have gotten a little figurative to describe how furious of a beast this was? It's possible, but he wasn't figurative anywhere else. Could this have been a dinosaur that breathed fire? I believe Leviathan was probably a dinosaur. Could it have been a dragon, which was a form of a dinosaur? Did you know? Did you know the dodo bird? The dodo bird for hundreds of years was considered a mythical creature until its fossils were found on the tiny island nation of Mauritius off the coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean. All right, this dodo bird, it was a flightless bird that made it easy to catch. This provided food for sailors. As they were sailing, they would stop. Everybody knew if you're hungry, you need food, you can stop on Mauritius, you can catch these dodo birds. Because they were so easy to catch, they very quickly became extinct. There were many written accounts and drawings of the dodo bird throughout the 1500s and 1600s, but after they went extinct in the 1600s, they were forgotten about, and scientists began to proclaim that they were only a myth. Consider the argument for it being a myth. It was a very strange creature, a bird with no wings. Nobody could find them. They seemed to exist only in old descriptions, accounts, and drawings. And on top of that, it was typically heathen sailors and pirates. Consider the dragon, considered for hundreds of years to be a myth. Strange flying reptile that breathed fire. We can't seem to find any evidence of it. It's typically found in accounts of, guess who? Sailors and pirates and people like that saw them. But get this about the dragon. There are more ancient descriptions, drawings, and historical accounts of dragons than there are of the dodo bird. There are history books that are written about Viking fights, that everything else in there is historically accurate, but mixed in there is flying, fire-breathing animals that were flying above them in the fight. Many of these accounts are linked with descriptions, drawings, and accounts also of the dinosaurs. 14 times in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for dragon, the Hebrews had a word for dragon, and that word is used 14 times in the Old Testament. But since the dragon is considered mythical, it eventually stopped being translated as dragon and is now translated as sea monster or monster. 4 other times in the Old Testament, a fiery serpent is mentioned. Another thing, the dragon was not considered mythical until the 1900s. And just because no animal today breathes fire, that does not mean that one never has breathed fire. For instance, this is an animal that lives today, the bombardier beetle. The bombardier beetle ejects a hot chemical spray of hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone that can burn you to defend itself against predators. There's a beetle that spits fire. I don't want to deal with that beetle, right? So the short answer to Leviathan, I guess short answer to dragons, I don't know. I'm not telling you there were dragons. I'm not going to go that far. I'm telling you there could have been. At one time they didn't think there was a dodo bird. There seems to be a lot of evidence for a dragon. I'm just not bold enough to claim that there definitely was. This description of Leviathan fits the description of a dragon, though. If not, then it at least fits the description of a dinosaur. All right. So, very quickly, were the dinosaurs on the ark? Yes. Why do we know that? Genesis 7, 2 through 3 and 8 through 9. They had to bring on 2 of every kind of animal. And even though there are certainly hundreds of different dinosaur fossils that were found, that does not mean that there are hundreds of different kinds of dinosaurs. Just like if you were to find hundreds of dog fossils, those fossils will look vastly different. You have the little tiny poodles, you have the giant Great Danes. I mean, dogs come in all different shapes and sizes today, yet it doesn't change the fact that all those fossils are a dog. All right? So the same thing, though there may have been hundreds of different types of dinosaurs, Noah only had to bring on 2 dinosaurs. Those dinosaurs, just like all the other animals, were most likely children, which is why they could be contained and you didn't have lions eating people, and giraffes could fit on the boat because They didn't have the giant heads. They were babies. He most likely brought on babies or children. Also, Noah probably brought on the dinosaurs that would not eat him. Consider if you had to bring a dog into your house, would you choose a lab or a pit bull? Most of us would choose a lab. I started to say a poodle or a pit bull, but many might choose the pit bull over the poodle. But most would choose it. You're not going to choose like a lab or a Rottweiler or some dog that could eat you. You're not going to choose a pit bull or a Rottweiler, some dog that's going to eat you. You're going to choose a nice cuddly one. Most likely Noah did not bring on a family of T-Rexes, right? He brought on dinosaurs that weren't going to kill him. And so what happened to the dinosaurs? All right? These are all reasons that are given by conventional paradigm scientists. Dinosaurs starved to death. They died from overeating. So one says they starved, the other said they ate too much. They were poisoned. They became blind from cataracts. I guess they got really old. They could not reproduce. Mammals ate their eggs. Other causes include volcanic dust, poisonous gases, comets, sunspots, meteorites, mass suicide. Who knew? Constipation, parasites, shrinking brains, slipped disc. Dinosaurs are really old. Changes in the composition of the air, and on and on and on. Clearly, they have no idea. All right. Here is what happened very quickly. Most of them drowned in the flood. Most of them drowned in the flood, other than the ones that could survive in the water and the ones that Noah brought onto the ark. In fact, did you know this? The T-Rex, though it's the most popular of all the dinosaurs, it is one of the dinosaurs that they are known least about because T-Rex fossils are only found in water deposits. So the T-Rex, most likely, again, Noah didn't bring the T-Rex onto the ark. The T-Rex drowned in the flood. T-Rex also, Tyrannosaurus rex, comes from the word tyrant lizard king. Just free information that I found. Tyrant lizard king. All right, so the ones that then made it through the flood would have died for a variety of reasons, all right? One, when they came off the ark, there weren't any plants and trees and everything. The world was destroyed. And so now there was great competition for food that was no longer in abundance, not just among the dinosaurs, but among all animals. And so many of them probably did starve or kill each other because they were all fighting over the same food. Secondly, change habitats. Many of those animals, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, a lot of those other animals, when they came out, it was a completely different habitat than the ones that they were in because the world had just been destroyed. Third, changed atmosphere that led to the Ice Age. And so many the other dinosaurs would have been frozen in the Ice Age. After the flood, the processes of the water's cooling would have caused the Ice Age. Again, I ran through this last week, and I read this in closing. Tremendous heating of the waters of the earth would have occurred during the flood as a result of the underwater volcanic activity. Then God sends the winds to dry the earth. Water is evaporating off the warm oceans, which the oceans are cooling. The wind is cooling the oceans off, but it's hot and cool at the same time. Water's evaporating, which again, the water cycle then drops large amounts of precipitation. But since that warm water is cooling so quickly, it causes that precipitation to freeze in many parts of the globe as snow and ice. And this snow and ice are then going down so rapidly, again, because they're up, they're going down with the water, they're going down so rapidly and continuously that it can't melt. And it accumulates into thick sheets of ice until they are miles thick. Once the oceans have cooled enough that the precipitation slows, these massive glaciers then begin to collapse under their own weight, melt to their current position, and they are continuing to melt. You may say, the Ice Age happened when people were alive, how could people live? There were only 8 people alive at the time. They didn't live in the parts of the globe where the Ice Age happened and to where all these animals died. And so what happened to the dinosaurs? The flood killed most of them. There was no food when they came off the ark. Habitat changed, atmosphere changed. Dinosaurs, along with woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and other animals, done. So that's a lot, and it's 7:30. But look, I enjoyed studying this. If any of you do want some of the resources that Hillary and I used to research this, I'll be glad to give it to you. The main place is Answers in Genesis. There's a video I watched today. It's actually a movie that's on YouTube, and I can't think of it either. The one with the scientist from Auburn that created that video. But if you want some of those resources, just let me know, and I can get those to you for anybody that wants to do further studies. All right, very quickly. Patsy Abbott is in the hospital. It was believed to be congestive heart failure, but rather